We're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening. Thank you all for coming out to the University of Louisville tonight. If you're joining us on YouTube, we thank you for being part of the conversation. My name is Bryson Sebastian. I'm a junior McConnell Scholar. I'm the Academic Vice President of the Student Government Association here at the University of Louisville. Tonight, we continue the McConnell Center's year-long attempt to better understand the foundations of contemporary political thought with our series, Variety, Left and Right. Coming off a month of programs on how to have civil conversations, we're now exploring the roots and variety of conservatism this month before turning our eyes towards liberalism in November. We hope you all continue to be engaged in all our programs throughout the year, and you can find videos of our past programs on our website. Matthew Continetti is a senior fellow in the inaugural Patrick and Charlene Neal Chair in American Prosperity at the American Enterprise Institute, where his work is focused on American political thought and history with a particular focus on the development of the Republican Party and the American Conservative movement in the 20th century. A prominent journalist, analyst, author, and intellectual historian of the right, Mr. Continetti was the founder and editor-in-chief of the Washington Free Beacon. Previously, he was opinion editor at the Weekly Standard. Mr. Continetti is also a contributing editor at the National Review and a columnist for Commentary magazine. He's been published in The Atlantic, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, among other outlets. He also appears frequently on Fox News Channel's Special Report with Brett Baier and MSNBC's Meet the Press Daily with Chuck Todd. Mr. Continetti is the author of 3 books, including, most recently, The Right, The 100-Year War for American Conservatism, which he will talk about with us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Matthew Continetti.
Thank you all for coming. It's great to be here at the University of Louisville and at the McConnell Center. So really, we need to rename the McConnell Center after one of Leader McConnell's many nicknames. He has so many of them. So the Old Crow Center, or I think the Democrats call Leader McConnell the Undertaker, right? The Undertaker Center. As we were touring the McConnell Museum, Gary and I were speaking about one of my mentors, the journalist Fred Barnes. And Fred recently announced his retirement. And when we were celebrating his retirement, we went over a few of his great quips. I'll share a few of them to start my talk tonight. At a toast for his mentor, journalist Robert Novak, Fred once said, "Bob, your words will be remembered long after Shakespeare's are forgotten, but not before then." Fred was a great source of one-liners like this. He once told an intern at the Weekly Standard who was struggling over an article, "This ain't Balzac, it's journalism." And 8 or so years ago, at 9 now, when I complained to Fred that my infant son was keeping me and my wife up at night, Fred said, "Don't worry, it only gets harder." One of Fred's most famous lines happened during an editorial meeting at our magazine. A colleague complained that an article that was about to be published lacked a certain pizzazz. Basically, it was poorly written. It wasn't a very good article. But Fred interrupted the meeting. He said, "You're forgetting one good thing about this piece. It has the quality of doneness." Well, after many years of work, I'm happy to say that my history of the past century of American conservative thought and politics, the right, now shares in the quality of doneness. It's been out for months, but I'm continually surprisingly pleased to see interest in the book, and I hope that you are interested enough after the end of my talk to buy a copy or 2. It will make raising my kids a little easier. Prove Fred wrong. Today I want to introduce you to some of the main themes of the book, though, and maybe point at the question of how the past might explain where the right finds itself today. On July 7, 2003, 3 months into the Second Iraq War, I showed up at a building in Washington, D.C. with the address 1150 17th Street Northwest. I had just turned 22 years old, and it was my first day as an editorial assistant at the Weekly Standard magazine. At the time, 1150 17th Street was the frontal cortex of the American conservative movement. On the same floor of the Standard was a small think tank called the Project for the New American Century, which devoted itself to reports on the state of American defenses and writing open letters urging regime change in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The top floors of the building hosted the think tank where I work today, the American Enterprise Institute, And also located in 1150 17th Street was the Philanthropy Roundtable, which was an association of center-right nonprofits. Around the corner was the offices of the magazine The Public Interest. And next to that, nearby, was the offices of another small think tank called the Ethics and Public Policy Center. If you walked up Connecticut Avenue from 1150 17th Street, you would find the DC offices of the Hoover Institution, just south of DuPont Circle. In fact, in 2004, I realized that when I was walking into that building, I was walking not only into a structure, but into an intellectual and political movement. That year, two editors of The Economist magazine wrote a book called The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America. And reading it, I felt a thrill of recognition when the authors identified 1150 17th Street as the center of a Rive Droit, a right bank of intellectual activity in the nation's capital. Well, that Rive Droit is gone now. The building at 1150 17th Street was demolished in 2016. In fact, I was reminded recently that a fire broke out within its empty shell on election night 2016, the physical manifestation of that election's impact on the conservative movement of the time. The project for the New American Century no longer exists, neither does the Weekly Standard. 2003 is a distant memory, and the intellectual community housed within that building, 1150, has been dispersed. I've spent the last decade wondering why. How, I asked, had Mitt Romney lost the 2012 election, only to see Donald Trump win it 4 years later? Was the Trump coalition, I wondered, the echo of Richard Nixon's silent majority, the Reagan Democrats, and Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution? Or was it something different, something new? What explained the gulf between my colleagues in Washington and self-identified conservatives outside the Beltway? Why had matters long thought settled, the benefits of trade, the advantages of immigration, the necessities of war, become so hotly contested? Why, come to think of it, was there a conservative movement at all? As I read old books, magazines, journals, and letters, I found that 20th century conservatism had been motivated by a sense of impending crisis, a feeling that the free societies of the West were in danger. The surface cause of this crisis, conservatives believed, was the growth of the state and the expansion of territory under communist dominion. But the loss of physical ground was but a consequence of spiritual impoverishment, a lack of confidence in ourselves, an unwillingness to take stands and to roll back threats. What caused this enfeeblement? No one knew. Or rather, no one could agree. Traditionalists said one thing, libertarians said another. And this difference brought me to my first conclusion about American conservatism. It is not one thing. It is many different, many squabbling, many disagreeable things. Try to define American conservatism. There is no single answer. But the adjective modifying the noun provides a clue. American conservatism is exactly that, American, as opposed to, say, European conservatism. Conservatives defend. When the term was born in the late 18th century during the French Revolution, European conservatives defended the established institutions of monarchy, state church, aristocratic privilege, national language, and culture. What about the Americans? We have no king, no official religion, no titled classes. The national language takes care of itself. Indeed, it's becoming the world language. Our national culture is as multifaceted and wild and as eccentric and occasionally violent as our population. What do Americans conserve? Here's my answer. American conservatives defend the founding idea of liberty in the familial, communal, religious, and political institutions that sustain it. American conservatism must refer to our national origin, the American founding, if it is to have any anchor and enjoy any success. But my answer is not the only option. American conservatism is a contested tradition. Those traditionalists I mentioned earlier, they argue that order, justice, and religious virtue are of equal value and perhaps superior to political and economic freedom. The libertarians, they take the opposite stand. For them, freedom is the primary value. Religion and communal life, what the economist Milton Friedman once called the ethical problem, that's best left to the individual. Cold warriors, against the Soviet Union argued that the preeminent concern of the 20th century was the rise of communism, and that meant a permanent defense establishment and intervention overseas to defeat the Red Menace. Agrarians despised capitalism as destructive of Southern folkways. Political philosophers on the West Coast said that the conservatism was worthless unless it was based on the idea that all men are created equal. Fusionists thought that freedom and virtue worked in tandem and that true virtue is uncoerced. Some Catholics said that fusionists were wrong, that the primary end of political life is virtue, and that Americanism is a false ideology. Neoconservatives looked at all the other groups skeptically and said that they were ready to maintain the New Deal and many programs of LBJ's Great Society. The paleoconservatives blamed the neoconservatives for polluting the right with statism, immigration, free trade, and foreign intervention. I'm barely scratching the surface. None of the different camps within American conservatism were ever as powerful as the others believed. And the picture becomes more complicated still when you consider that the divisions are not only based in ideas, they're structural. The Republican Party, for example, is not naturally conservative. It's a political party. It reflects the values and principles of its members. True, its leaders have a record of supporting constitutionalism and economic freedom. Many conservatives have called it home for many decades. But in its efforts to win 50% plus one of the vote, the GOP has often strayed from conservative principle. That is why the foremost goal of the American conservative movement in the second half of the 20th century was to capture the Republican Party and convert it into a vehicle for conservative public policy. But that movement is not the same as the GOP. The conservative movement has always had a separate existence and a tempestuous relationship with its political vehicle. The conservative movement is comprised of institutions and activists. They are the single-issue people, advocates of gun rights, the right to life, the right to work, property rights, taxpayer rights, school choice, religious freedom, family values. DC is filled with their offices. They exist to pressure the Republican Party, to hold it to account. And they are often disappointed, their hopes often unfulfilled. Like activists of all stripes, sometimes they have trouble taking yes for an answer. The movement is greater than the intellectuals. Now, the intellectuals' books, magazines, newsletters, television appearances, and tweets give them prominence, give them notoriety. But in fact, they are the smallest part of this conservative coalition I'm describing. You could fit all of them, really, into this auditorium very easily. Maybe there'd be some spillover in the hall. The politicians pay less attention to the intellectuals than to the interest groups. Party prerogatives matter even more. It is often tempting, then, to take the intellectuals at their word, to assume what they are saying reflects the biases of the movement and the agenda of the GOP. Don't make that mistake. And finally, there's a broader category of thinker who may dissent from mainstream conservatives, who may criticize the American founding, may be hostile to currents in American society, but nonetheless still opposes the left. They belong to what I call the right. Each element of this coalition needs to be understood on its own terms, and none of it works together easily. For over a century, the intellectuals, activists, and politicians have been arguing about the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the place of minority rights in a majoritarian democracy, the tension between a populist desire for liberty and an elite commitment to institutions, and the choice between isolationist protection and international engagement. Get two conservatives together and you will have at least 3 points of view. This fractiousness contributes to the movement's dynamism. It contributes to the movement's adaptability, its continued relevance. But the diversity of opinion within conservatism is often ignored. Outside observers, mainly liberal historians, tend to downplay the differences on the right. They pathologize all conservatism as the expression of status anxiety, bigotry, phobia. They're not only wrong, in my view, but they blind themselves to the realities of American politics and to the weaknesses of their own position. Conservatives shouldn't make the same mistake, but they do. They commit the fallacy of composition, taking the part for the whole. And that wouldn't happen, I think, if they devoted more attention to the study of their own past. Conservatism is not monolithic, and history is not linear. As a sociologist, Daniel Bell used to joke, the greatest historian in the world is Dr. Hindsight. When we look at the past, we need to recognize the influence of personal agency, of individual human will, and we need to recognize the role of chance, what appears to us as a logical chain of events in retrospect, was actually contingent. Conservatives like to say that ideas have consequences. That's true. Accidents have consequences too. We don't like to admit it. Conservatives and liberals tell themselves stories about the American right. They say that their movement began in the wilderness. Then William F. Buckley Jr., the founder of National Review, came along. He led the American right to political relevance by winning the 1964 Republican nomination for Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater lost that year in 1964, and by a considerable margin, but the ashes of his candidacy were fertile soil for Ronald Reagan, who brought conservatives to power in 1980. Since the heights of Reagan's presidency, conservatives say, the movement has endured setbacks and divisions. Conservatism still shapes American democracy through a set of intellectual institutions and media platforms that give it a voice in public debate and an influence in politics that was unimaginable before this movement began. Conservatives admit that Donald Trump's June 2015 descent on the escalator in Trump Tower caused friction within their movement. But they also believe that he recalibrated conservatism along populist and nationalist lines and attracted new constituencies to its cause. The liberal version of the story I just told is not that different. It also begins slightly after World War II. It also begins with conservatism in exile. But the left tends to ascribe the rise of the right not to failures of liberal governance, but to a racist backlash against civil rights that has grown only worse with time. While the story that conservatives tell themselves highlights institutions and politicians, left-wingers play up grassroots organizations, big league financial donors, and psychological motivations. For the left, the story of American conservatism is the story of American populist revolt. It is a long-running berserk refusal to submit to the ministrations of liberal rule. For the left, Trump is not a deviation from American conservatism. He is its endpoint. Both stories contain elements of truth, but neither captures the American right in its full complexity. The conservative narrative is too neat. The edges of the movement have been smoothed over. Its blemishes have been covered up or ignored. But the left's narrative overcorrects for the right's mistakes. It ends up pathologizing conservatism. It reduces a vast and complex movement to nothing more than the ongoing expression of base prejudice. This diagnosis might explain the behavior of some of the men and women who have associated with the conservative movement and voted for Republican candidates, but it does not explain the whole. Both of the conservative and liberal stories are too pat. They give the impression that it was always inevitable that conservatism would arrive at this moment. It wasn't inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, at least nothing in the realm of human affairs. Part of the problem is that both conservative and liberal stories are warped by what I call the Reagan distortion field. They revolve around the 40th president. They can't see past him. They take him as the central character in the history when he should be treated as one character among many. Both conservatives and liberals treat Reagan as the benchmark of conservatism, the measure of what conservatism was and what it should be. For conservatives, Reagan is the protagonist in a hero's journey that begins in the Screen Actors Guild and ends up riding off into the California sunset. For liberals, Reagan is either a befuddled clown or a charming Machiavellian. They can't decide which. He either accidentally or slyly manipulated America into enacting a pro-corporate agenda of tax cuts, reductions in welfare spending, and hostility to labor. Certainly, Ronald Reagan's historical importance cannot be denied, but neither can his uniqueness. Reagan's charisma and clarity were an exception in the history of American conservatism. His unique political talent led almost every faction within the right to think that he was on its side. To this day, every conservative still wants to claim Reagan for himself. Last December, the Pew Foundation asked Republicans which president had done the best job in the past 40 years. Reagan came in first place. Donald Trump was close behind. The truth about Reagan is messier. Reagan's presidency was not the preordained outcome of the post-war conservative movement. Reagan always was just one alternative among many. His triumph in 1980 was unplanned. His victory in 1984 was the result of his courage in staying the course with highly controversial and often unpopular policies. He didn't acquire mythic status until years after he left the White House. When you focus on Reagan, you are tricked into thinking that ideas can be seamlessly translated into action, and that conservative elites share the same priorities as the conservative grassroots. This is a mistake. Reagan shows us what is possible, as he often said he wanted to do. But he's an exception. It's rare for the elites and the public to agree. They are more often in tension. Does American conservatism represent insiders or outsiders? Are conservatives the elites, the men and women in charge of America's political, economic, social, and cultural institutions? Or are the conservatives the people? That is the question that faces every generation, and it is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered for long. The story of American conservatism, in my view, is the dynamic between elite-driven ideas and populist mobilization against liberal extremism. Conservatives have toggled between the two strategies as they've built institutions and professional networks and tried to meet normal people where they are, as well as to respond to their ambitions, passions, and animosities. No tricks are involved. Any successful political movement must incorporate both elites and the people. Only intermittently, however, have conservatives been able to synthesize these two elements. That is why conservatism's victories have been so tenuous, and why its coalition often proves so fragile. I'll give you an example of an elite-driven strategy. Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist, published The Road to Serfdom in England in 1944. It came out in America the following year. Dedicated to the socialists of all parties, Hayek's book was a warning against abandoning economic freedom for central economic planning. This move, he said, would set nations on the primrose path to totalitarianism. The Road to Serfdom was a sensation, but books, even one as successful as serfdom, were not enough for Hayek. He wanted to build an institution devoted to the promotion of economic freedom and individualism. He wanted to establish a global network of classical liberals. Its first meeting was held in Mont Pelerin, Switzerland, and the Mont Pelerin Society was born on April 1st, 1947. Hayek articulated his overall strategy in a 1949 essay called The Intellectuals and Socialism. Ideas drive history, Hayek believed, and thus intellectuals, what he called professional second-hand dealers in ideas, were far more important than most people assume. In every country that has moved towards socialism, Hayek wrote, the phase of the development in which socialism becomes a determining influence on politics has been preceded by many years by a period during which socialist ideals govern the thinking of the more active intellectuals. Hayek's approach was directed at the people running things. A change in the ideas, he thought, would result in a change in political reality. But that would only happen after enough intellectuals became convinced of the classical liberal ideal. The libertarians associated with Hayek turned to education, writing great works and popular pamphlets, issuing new editions of great classical liberal texts, teaching at universities and in privately funded seminars, to pull the rising generation of elites toward their viewpoint. Elite-driven strategies begin with the work of intellectuals, whose ideas shift the climate of opinion in society by permeating institutions and gradually shaping the beliefs of young people. This elite-driven strategy eventually depended on conservative mastery of what a former vice president for the Heritage Foundation called the decision-making loop. Formulate concepts, communicate them to policymakers, and then watch as theory is translated into practice. But here conservatives faced a dilemma. Since 1932, they rarely found themselves in positions of power. Gaining access to the levers of policy required another force. It required populism. So what is populism? Like conservatism, there is no easy answer. My friend, the late Jeffrey Bell, once defined populism as confidence in the decision-making power of everyday people, while elitism, he said, is confidence in the decision-making power of experts. Populist revolt takes place when long-standing policies no longer live up to their promise, when elites or experts won't acknowledge or respond to changing circumstances, when these same elites interfere in private decision-making, especially familial decision-making. Populism is a feature of democracy. The United States has a long experience with it. And populism is a catalyst for political change. It expresses neglected concerns. It frames politics as a debate between elites and the people. And whoever is on the side of the people, well, they tend to win. Populism has left and right varieties, and sometimes they meet at the extremes. But populism, the rejection of expert rule, also fueled some of conservatism's greatest victories from the 1960s to today. When experts screw things up, or when they attempt to mess with children, populism rears its head, and conservatives win. For much of the 20th and early 21st century, conservatism and populism worked in tandem. They were synchronized. They produced a conservative governing class in the presidencies of Ronald Reagan and the two Bushes. But beginning in George W. Bush's second term, elite-driven conservatism diverged from the populist grassroots. It wasn't only the liberal elites that populists began to challenge. They went after conservative elites, too. In my view, the divide emerged with the debates over immigration in Bush's second administration. It became visible in the anti-war Ron Paul liberty movement in 2008. By the time of Barack Obama's presidency, the populists were in open revolt against the DC establishment. And the Tea Party, not the GOP, the Tea Party was the vehicle to remove pro-war, pro-immigration, and pro-trade Republicans from office. The 2012 election was a turning point. Mitt Romney, in some ways, represented the best that the elite-driven strategy of conservatism could offer the American electorate. He lost. And President Obama's second term initiated what I think was a crisis in democratic legitimacy. The 2014 border crisis and Obama's subsequent expansion of his deferred action immigration program, despite his stated position repeated multiple times that he lacked power to do so, and then a midterm election which went horribly for him, convinced the populist grassroots that only a disruptor, someone from outside, could rebalance the system. Civil unrest in the form of the Black Lives Matter movement and chaos abroad with the rise of ISIS in Obama's final years caused many people to think that the situation, both domestically and abroad, was spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, years of slow growth had dulled the American economy. The populist grassroots turned to Donald Trump as an outsider who could run government like a business, secure the border, and reorient the nation away from the Obama legacy. International trade, in my view, was Trump's way of explaining the collapse of male labor force participation and the growth of deaths of despair from drug and alcohol abuse. Trump's strongest supporters within conservatism came from the network of institutions, spokesmen, and causes that had propelled earlier populist revivals in the late 1970s. He was anti-GOP establishment. All the single-issue groups were behind him. And when he became president, he disordered this decision-making loop, even as he adopted many of the policies that elites had advocated for decades, such as corporate tax reform or conservative judges. What began in the 20th century as an elite-driven defense of the classical liberal principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States ended up in the first quarter of the 21st century as a furious rebellion against elites of all stripes. Many on the right went further, embracing a cult of personality and illiberal, unfreedom-like tropes. The danger became that alienation from and antagonism toward American culture and society could turn into a general opposition toward the entire constitutional order. What then are conservatives to do? What is conservatism for? As the future unfolds, conservatives must return to the wisdom of their best minds and advocates. As William F. Buckley, Jr., in many ways the founder of post-war American conservatism, said in 1970, "I see it as the continuing challenge of the American conservative to argue the advantages to everyone of the rediscovery of America, the amiability of its people, the flexibility of its institutions, of the great latitude that is still left to the individual, the delights of spontaneity, and above all, the need, in Buckley's words, for superordinating the private vision over the public vision." This rediscovery of America must center on America's founding documents, for there would be no American conservatism without the American founding. The Constitution and its amendments ground conservatives eager to preserve and extend the blessings of liberty that are the right of every American. The Constitution grounds conservatives in a uniquely American tradition of political thought that balances individual rights and popular sovereignty through the separation of powers and of federalism. The Constitution not only protects human freedom, it also creates a space for the deeper satisfactions of family, religion, community, and voluntary association. One cannot be an American patriot without reverence for the nation's enabling documents, nor can one be an American conservative without regard for the American tradition of liberty those documents inaugurated. America cannot abandon the great principles of classical liberalism, wrote philosopher Harvey Mansfield. Above all, the principle of self-government, and with it, the constitutional means for achieving and preserving it. The long and winding road on which the various bands of conservatives have traveled over the last century has brought them to a fair amount of political power, but also to cultural despair. Conservatives are confused, uncertain, anxious, and inward-looking, even as they eagerly await the populist repudiation of the Democrats that seems to be coming in 2 weeks. That building I walked into 20 years ago at 1150 17th Street is gone, but the story does not end there. Can conservatives harmonize their principles with the sentiments of the current populist revolt? Can they reformulate a conservative governing class for the second quarter of the 21st century? I am confident that they can, for when you study conservatism's past, you become convinced that it has a future. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Continetti. Mr. Continetti, we'll take a few questions from the audience. Please wait until we have the microphone to you before speaking, so our friends online can hear the question. Phrase it in the form of a question, not a statement, so we can get as many questions as possible in. Does anybody have any questions to start us off?
There's one over there. Brave man.
Thank you very much for being with us this evening. My question is, we had Dr. Nash, George Nash here of the Hoover Institution a few weeks ago, and he spoke a lot about some of the current trends within the conservative intelligentsia, so to speak, the NatCons versus the post-libs. Could you speak to some of your thoughts about the state of the conservative intellectual movement today within those two factions as it relates to, as they would say, against the dead consensus, as you've outlined with some of the Reaganism sort of deal? That's not me editorializing, that's again, their words.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a funny thing about the state of conservatism. On the surface levels, the Republican Party is about to have one of its best elections in over a decade. I think we're looking at least a 2010-like event. One, in some ways, it would be better than 2010, because in 2010, the Republican Party captured only the House of Representatives. Some candidates cost them the Senate. It may happen again, but it seems to me that they'll be able to win the Senate. And of course, the reason that they're on track to have a good year is they had a good year in 2020. Quite surprisingly to many of the political observers in Washington. They picked up 14 House seats. They started off with 52 Senate seats, then they lost 2 in the intermission and end up with a 50-50 tie. Conservatives and Republicans, again, not always the same thing, dominate the states. At the political level, it's very strong. And the states matter. I think we shouldn't forget, too. The states are the laboratories of democracy. If you look at what Governor Doug Ducey has done to education, with education, done positively to education in Arizona, I think we look at education reform as the welfare reform of the 2020s. In the 1990s, it was the states that took the lead on welfare reform. They showed the federal government that you could reform welfare with work while not increasing poverty, right? While not leaving children in the gutter. And the federal Republicans took that over. I think something similar will happen with education policy. Some expressions of conservative pessimism continue to amaze me when you consider that in the term of the Supreme Court just concluded, one of the signal goals of the American conservative movement for almost 50 years was achieved, and that is the reversal of the Roe v. Wade holding. On top of that, that court reaffirmed the individual right to bear arms, and it lobbed a missile aimed directly at the heart of the central bureaucracy with its decision in the EPA case, where it says that Congress can no longer simply delegate huge, vast expanses of authority to the bureaucracy. So politically, strong. constitutionally advancing, right? Next week, the court will hear the major affirmative action case. And judging from the precriminations and the reactions, the pre-reactions to what will happen, I think we'll see the end of affirmative action this term, right? Intellectually, though, the right's a mess. So it's a funny thing. You have these great conservative victories obscuring, in many ways, revolt and confusion. You mentioned a few of the groups. They go under the rubric, the new right. Now, according to my research, they're basically the fourth new right in the last 100 years. So they're the newest right. And they disagree with the conservatism of what you might call the 20th century conservatism, the conservatism of limited government, non-arbitrary power, American engagement, leadership overseas. And they have different factions. You named a few of them. It can get quite confusing. But the bulk of them seem to be under this umbrella of national conservatism. They released a statement of principles over the summer. And while I feel that there are many things in that statement of principles that conservatives of my tradition can work with, there are also some major differences. For one thing, the national conservatives do not talk about the Declaration of Independence. They don't like that, because the Declaration of Independence set up what Abraham Lincoln called the standard maxim of free society, which is the idea that we are all created equal and that our Creator gives us rights. And as Lincoln pointed out, that doesn't apply to just one group. In fact, it applies to everybody. NatCons don't like that. They're a little bit, they kind of contained a parachute on federalism. They say federalism's good unless the states start doing something we don't like. That's not actually how federalism works, right? They flirt with a moratorium on all immigration to the United States. Now, I think that the conservative movement has largely been against illegal immigration and for border security. And those are two things that I believe are important. However, that's a drastic move to say, well, we're not taking any more immigrants. So there are a variety of ways in which they depart. And I think what's going to happen is a contest of ideas. This new right, like the new left of several generations ago, is marching through the institutions. You already see many of the major institutions of the conservative movement turning in their direction. But just like the new left aimed itself directly at kind of mainstream liberals, the new right today aims itself directly at mainstream conservatives. And while the new left was very successful, there were some liberals left. There were some dissident liberals left. I think there will be some conservatives left as well. And they're just going to have to learn to somehow operate in a coalition with one another. But it won't be pretty. But as I was saying, no part of the history of the right has been pretty. Any other questions? There's one over here.
Mr. Continetti, thank you for coming again. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on the Peter Thiel and his protege who was running for the Ohio Senate, whose name I cannot remember.
Really? J.D. Vance?
J.D. Vance, thank you.
He's in a neighboring.
I was wondering if you would speak a little bit to that vein of conservatism and the new right, where it came from, what its place could be in the new coalition.
Yes, yes. So Peter Thiel is a billionaire, co-founder of PayPal, board member of Facebook for many years, founder and CEO, or for a time CEO of Palantir, kind of the surveillance company. He has gone from being a libertarian, so in that cast of characters I laid out, someone who was very much interested in individual freedom, to thinking that the political economy of globalization, what we call globalization, the free flows of capital, people, goods, has been bad for the United States. and he definitely believes that American intervention overseas has been bad for the United States. And so he became an early supporter of Donald Trump. He was the first out gay Republican to speak at a Republican National Convention in 2016. And he's continued to kind of fund causes and institutions and politicians who represent his views. And two of them running for the Senate this year are Blake Masters in Arizona, who was formerly his chief of staff, his aide-de-camp, and J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy in Ohio. What's interesting about both these candidates is that they are running behind very popular mainstream conservatives in their own states. Okay, so in fact, that's DeWine running as governor in Ohio, and Vance is behind him. Of course, the gubernatorial candidate in Arizona is not a mainstream conservative. That's Carrie Lake, and she's part of this new right too. But she's running way ahead of Masters. Maybe because she emphasizes different things. She definitely has a different style. Thiel's part of this national conservative movement I mentioned. He has spoken, I think, at all three. He definitely spoke at the most recent ones. You know, we've had billionaires buy senators before. You know, have their senators before. We may have two of them in the next Senate. But I think it's revealing that neither candidate is doing as well as they might do on a generic basis, right? For a variety of reasons. I mean, take J.D. Vance, for example. And he's ahead, but he's not ahead by much, and he's really being harmed by some of his foreign policy views. You know, he said on the record that he doesn't care what happens in Ukraine, and in a state with a large Ukrainian population, like Ohio, that may have turned out to be a mistake, right? Masters, he's not a politician, right? He's kind of goofy. He did fine in his debate. He probably, I think, will make it across the finish line. But the fact that we're not so sure about that, I think, suggests that even while a large part of the intellectual right is with Thiel and with these national conservatives and this new right, actual voters aren't, right? And to my mind, you have to convince the voters. And it may be that some of those more mainstream conservative views that I think that still have appeal to the voters, despite the right convincing itself otherwise. But we'll see.
So we have an online question from Secretary of State Mike Adams. He asks, how can conservatism adapt to an anti-federalist focus on D.C. driven by influencers, talking heads, and the demise of local media, and to the decline of civic society, which both undermine core tenets of modern conservative philosophy?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I understand the question correctly, it's how can we revitalize local conservatism? And I think that has to do with, it has to be a ground-up movement. It involves recognizing that even though our politics are as national, our society really isn't. Our society is what we find around us. It's our communities, it's our churches, it's where we live, it's our local schools. It's that whole realm of civil society that I think deserves our attention and deserves our support. If I have one criticism of the new right, and I have many, but one is that I think they collapse politics and society together. And in fact, for conservatives, there's always a separation between the two. There should be a realm of life that is not political. Now they would respond that the left has made everything political. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't respond to that by abandoning certain conservative values or ideas like competition and choice. So, For example, I refer you to the University of Austin that's being developed, right, as a kind of counter institution devoted to free exchange of ideas. And it seems to be getting off the ground. Again, I'll return to this idea of education reform. All of the alternatives in education are fascinating, whether it's the rise in homeschooling, again, creating a kind of preserve, right? Or whether it's homeschooling pods now, whether it's charter schools, parochial schools, and with the idea of universal school choice, you have competition. You have the fact that the parents are in the saddle. I think that can be extended elsewhere. But it also involves a political fight, which is to reassert rules and reassert limits on a left that clearly has gone out of bounds and is overrunning itself. I mean, that takes serious policy work, though. And it does take some cooperation between the grassroots and the elites. If there isn't such cooperation, I feel that many of our frustrations will only build, and we won't get anywhere. And that would be a tragedy because our problems are so real. Any other?
Thank you for your remarks. I have a question about social media. We were in Mecosta a year ago, and Annette Kirk had commented that Russell, as she said, wasn't a TV guy. Bill Buckley was a TV guy.
Yes.
And it was a very important difference in the way that they were able to assess conservative thought. And I'm wondering, in the context of social media, have you seen the intellectual wing of conservatism? Have you seen some who will cast away social media? Most that I'm familiar of live on social media.
Yeah.
I guess the follow-up question then would be, how do you think that impacts the intellectual movement of conservatism?
Well, I do think that conservatives have tended to embrace technologies to their advantage. Ronald Reagan was a TV guy. He spent the 50s on television. He was also a radio guy. His first jobs were in radio. So he embraced the communications medium that were available to him. I do think if William F. Buckley Jr. were alive today, he would probably tweet. I don't know if he'd be addicted to it, but he'd probably use it. I guess so many things, it's balance. What I've been struck by over the last few years and disturbed by is that there's a general coarsening in American culture. And online, people feel as though that they can get away with things that they would never say face to face. And so in online exchanges, you find obscenities, you find ad hominem attack, you find profanity. I mean, all the things your mother told you not to do, people do on social media. And, as a conservative, I would like to think that I'm somewhat above all that, right? I'd like to think that my arguments can be made in reasonable fashion, hopefully persuasively, knowing that I'm probably going to fail, but, So the medium then kind of dictates the message, right? And I think that's a challenge. At the same time, though, that there's been this explosion of new media, there's also a huge explosion of conservative media in general. And so there are a variety of different publications that are out. A lot of podcasts are out. Some of these podcasts are of very high quality, and they attract huge audiences. I'll say that, I found with this book over the past year, I get more response from appearing on a podcast than I do going on television. And that's really striking to me. And that suggests that that's actually where people get their media now. And podcasts are not tweets, I think there's a real danger in being overcommitted to Twitter because it's an enclosed universe. And it's what you call very online. And there's a real danger in divorcing yourself from the reality around you. These other media, I think, allow us to recognize the world and try to deal with it as it is, not what, somebody with an anonymous egg avatar is commenting on, snarkily on Twitter. So that's how I'd approach the medium. Conservative hero Aristotle said, moderation in all things. In the back? Time? Right there.
Hi, I'd like to thank you again for being here tonight with us, sir. The question I have is kind of related to, I'm trying to figure out how to word this exactly. So it seems that one of the struggles with the conservative intellectual movement has been its kind of reputation among racial and ethnic minorities.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess a question I have for you is, why do you think that perception may exist? And if so, how do you think that the modern conservative movement can look to change that?
Sure, that's a great question. A lot of that is a result of history. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. Up until 1960, it still attracted a fair amount of the African American vote at the presidential level. Beginning in 1964, that collapsed. And the Republican Party and the conservative movement, which of course captured the presidential nomination in 1964, has been trying to live with the consequences ever since. The irony there is that Barry Goldwater, the nominee in 1964, was not a racist man. He had desegregated the Senate cafeteria. He belonged to the Arizona NAACP. He was against discrimination. But for constitutional reasons, he found himself in the position of voting against the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And I think that's haunted the conservative movement ever since. What I find most interesting in our recent politics is that American politics has been polarized by race for many decades. But now it's not becoming polarized by race anymore, it's becoming polarized by education. And so what we see, for example, with the Hispanic vote in America is that Hispanic voters who used to be 70-30 Democrat are now voting their ideology. So if you're a Hispanic man who calls himself a conservative, when you talk to pollsters, you would still, up until about 2016, vote Democrat, because you were just a Democrat. The partisan label overwhelmed your ideology. Now that's changed. And so you're seeing this movement of Hispanic Americans toward the Republican Party, much like my family, the Continettis, as Italian Americans made a similar movement over the course of the 20th century. With the black vote, it's still highly monolithically Democrat. But I will say that black men in particular have been moving toward the Republican Party and at an increasing level. And how would a Republican or how would a conservative continue that? I think by stressing a few things. One, the idea of mobility and opportunity, right? People actually want to make something of themselves. They want to improve their lives. They want their children's life to be better than their own life. And we need to recognize that. And for many Hispanic Americans who are either legal immigrants or the children of immigrants, they think the American dream is about mobility and entrepreneurship and initiative. There's an incredibly diverse array of House GOP candidates this cycle. And I'm struck again and again by the Latino candidates stressing the American dream in almost all their messaging. And they believe in it. And the patriotism is part of that too. This idea that this is a good country, right? This country is not systemically oppressive. This country has big problems, it has stains in its past, but its ideals have what are the best of us. I mean, have led to great expansions in human standards of living, human freedom, right? Asserting those ideals of freedom, I think, are important, and we shouldn't forget that because or involved in some apocalyptic vision of American society. At the same time, the other thing I would mention is people respond to the radicalism of today's left. And you see in poll after poll that progressive whites are to the left on racial issues of black Americans, right? And so I think there's reaction to the overreach of the left is also responsible for growing numbers of minorities who are interested in the Republican Party, and I think especially with the Hispanic vote, we'll see voting for it in great numbers. That does, though, I mean, I think it does mean that you can't give up where the conservative movement landed after their problematic relationship to the civil rights movement. Eventually, the conservative movement repudiated those views and adopted the position of colorblindness. And I do think that that is a value, that the idea that the Constitution is colorblind is a true value. It's constitutionalist, and it's something that we shouldn't abandon in the pursuit of votes.
I don't want this to be too long for the end of the questions, but where would you, if you would at all, consider the structural underpinnings for Russell Kirk to continue on now from the time in the 50s when he wrote The Conservative Mind till what of that type of conservatism still exists, and in what form do you think it exists right now?
Well, Russell Kirk was a traditionalist. He placed his greatest emphasis on culture, and I think that that describes a great part, if not the greatest part, of the American right today. However, Kirk did have a skepticism toward populism. In one of his lectures at the Heritage Foundation in the 1980s, he was a little bit suspicious of populism for its the fact that its cup runneth over sometimes. It can spill over, it can get too enthusiastic. And Gary and I were talking about this earlier today. Kirk believed in limited government because he believed that the central bureaucratic state was the great enemy of traditional society. The bureaucracy was the centralizer, it was the leveler, it was the thing that imposed a uniform conformity over all the diversity of our lives, right, of our communities. So even though I think the American right is very Kirkian in many respects today in its emphasis on culture and history, I think he also, if you're in this as such a guessing game, of course, I think he would be a little hesitant to embrace it outright for this reason. Now, he would share its public policy, its foreign policy. And, you know, he was a supporter of Patrick Buchanan in 1992, when Buchanan, who in many ways is the John the Baptist of this conservative, the new right today, first ran for president. He would share its foreign policy. He would share its concern for American culture. But I do think he would try to reinforce the idea of limited government and not embrace this idea, which you do see today on the new right, that somehow, well, you know, the bureaucracy is not going away, so we might as well take it over and use it for our own ends. I think he would understand the dangers in that, right? And I think that's a beneficial reminder for today's right. You know, some of the central, Kirk is very good on the central philosophical insights of conservatism. You know, one is we are fallen creatures, and we need to be aware of our weaknesses. The other thing is that things are easily broken, but not easily fixed, right? And the third is the law of unintended consequences. You might start off on some path thinking, oh, I know exactly what my end is, and realize that the means you employ, the decisions you make, create a whole new set of problems you didn't anticipate. And I do worry that today's right has forgotten some of those central beliefs of conservatism that aren't just in Russell Kirk, but they're in Russell Kirk's ideal, which is Edmund Burke.
All right. So that'll conclude our questions for tonight. I want to thank Mr. Continetti again for taking your time to join us
Thank
on
you.
this.
Thank you for coming.
Helping us march through our quest to try to sort through, the history of American political ideals. We have a tradition here at the McConnell Center.
Yes.
We do for our friends from Washington.
I've been waiting for